Okay, so we're going to be recording this part of the session. If anybody has any objections with recording, please say so now. Okay, so what we've been talking about are the steps we need to follow in the design stage. And so we've already identified entities. We've defined the relationships between the entities. We've defined the cardinality of these relationships. And remember that the cardinality can be 1 to 1, it can be 1 to many, or it can be many to many. We establish the attributes for each entity, which are going to be these characteristics that define the entity. We haven't talked right now much about what characteristics the names of these should have. We're going to talk about that further on. Then we identify the primary key for each entity, which is basically that identifier that's going to be an attribute that's going to help me uniquely identify a particular instance or registry of the entity. And the last step is creating the ER diagram. And so the ER diagram is going to integrate all of these things. It's going to integrate all of these things into a visual representation of the system. And that's why it's called a diagram. ER means entity relationship. So it's going to be the entity relationship diagram. And let's see how that is created. And so the entity relationship diagram is going to have some symbology here that we're going to be using. First, entities are represented as rectangles. The name of the entity, we put that here inside the rectangle, inside the entity. A weak entity, remembering a weak entity is an entity that does not have an attribute that can be used as a primary key. Those are represented as a rectangle that has another rectangle within it. Relationships are represented with this pyramid shape, and inside the inside the diamond shape, we're going to identify the type of relationship that we're talking about. So we're going to say here if it is 1 to 1, 1 to n, or n to m within the diamond shape. And attributes are represented with these circles and a line connecting to the entity, and we put the name of the attribute in here. If it's a primary key attribute or a key attribute, then we underscore it. Some entity relationship diagrams don't have the attributes identified in the diagram. Why? Because it would make it might make it very messy. So they just have the entities and the relationships, or in some you might be able to, the attributes might be identified, and others not. And so basically what we have in the end is we're going to have a diagram that's kind of like this. So we're going to identify each of the entities. We're going to have the relationship here with the cardinality and the maximums and minimums that define each of the cardinality. We can also represent those. And basically, this is kind of how our diagram is going to look. Okay, so it's a visual representation of the system, its entities, its relationships. And in this case, for example, we don't have the attributes here identified. If we did, the attributes would be these little sort of bubbles that would be connected to each of the boxes. So let's look at an example. So again, we were talking about Sosacorp, which is this company that does things, product services. And it wants to have a system that manages the information relating its employees, departments, as well as different projects. We had already identified that the company is organized in departments. Departments have identifiers, names. There's an employee in charge of the department. A department manages a series of projects. Each of these also has, a unique identifier and name. We have employees that also have social security numbers, names, addresses, salary, gender, and birthday. Each employee is assigned to a department and may work in projects and can also manage a department. And we also have information regarding the employee's dependents. We had identified the entities. We had four entities: employee, department, project, and dependent. And each of these was uh, we defined the relationships that each of these entities had. So employees are assigned to departments, they manage departments, they supervise other employees, employees work on projects, employees have dependents, and departments manages projects. Those were the relationships that were established. We already went through all this previously. Then we defined the cardinality. And so for each of the relationships, we stated questions. So how many employees can be assigned to a department? One or many. How many departments can an employee be assigned to? One or one. And from these, we basically take, from the maximums and minimums, we basically are able to define the cardinality. An employee manages a department. How many employees can manage a department? One or one. How many departments can an employee manage? One, zero, or one. From the maximums, we are able to identify, again, the cardinality. All of this, we'd already gone through this. This is kind of a review before we get to the ER diagram. An employee supervises an employee. How many employees can supervise another employee? Zero or one. How many employees can have another employees under their supervision? Zero or many. From the maximums, we are able to identify the cardinality. An employee works on a project. How many employees can work on a project? One or many. How many projects can an employee work on? Zero or many. So from the maximums, we are able to identify the cardinality of the relationship. Then an employee has dependents. How many employees can be had by a dependent? One or one. How many dependents can an employee have? Zero or n. And from the maximums, we identify the cardinality of the whole relationship. A department manages a project. How many departments can manage a project? One or one. How many projects can a department manage? One or many. And so from these maximums, we identify the cardinality. And once we've done this, then we already have the cardinalities for all of the relationships. And this is kind of a summary of that. And so we've defined the entities, we've defined the relationships, we've defined the cardinality. Next up, we establish the attributes. So the attributes are given by the problem in this case. In some cases, we might not have that specific information, and we're going to have to maybe guess or identify or establish attributes as we see fit, depending on the situation. So employees have social security numbers, names, addresses, salary, gender, birth dates, status, if they're a manager or not, and then the manager's start date. Departments have department ID and name, projects have project ID and name, dependents have name, gender, and relationship. And we had established that the social security number here would be a primary key. The department ID would be another primary key, and the project ID would be a primary key. These are these attributes that can help me clearly identify or uniquely identify an instance of that entity. So this is a primary keys. Now we had noticed also that dependent does not have a primary key. So dependent would be a weak entity. And for now, we're just identifying weak entities. We're not really doing anything with them right now. But by identifying a weak entity, later on, we're going to be able to resolve that situation where that entity does not have a primary key. And there's a way to solve that. One is to simply add another attribute that removes the weak characteristic and makes it a normal entity. We could add an identifier, or when we move further along and start detailing more the design to implement for the implementation stage, there's a systematic way to do this. And so a summary of this is this: the ones that are marked here in asterisk are the primary keys. Okay. And we've got the weak entity here, which is dependent, and it's a weak entity. Okay. So now we've got everything. We've got the entities, we've got the relationships, we've got the cardinality, we've got the attributes. So now what we do is represent this in an ER diagram. Okay, so let's do that. So how do we do this in an ER diagram? Well, the ER diagram would look kind of like this. So first off, we've got the entities identified as boxes. Employee, department, project, and dependent. These are the four entities that we had identified. And then we had established the relationships. Okay. Depending on the type of ER diagram, sometimes the relationship itself could be written on top and the cardinality inside. Either way, it's not a problem. It's just we need to identify the relationship and also the cardinality. Okay, this is the important thing. It isn't necessary always to identify the maximums and minimums like here. For this diagram, it's done there just to be more explicit. But what's important is what's in purple and pink and orange. Notice another thing. When we were talking about the relationships, there were relationships where employee appeared many times. So employee had relationships with department, with projects, with employees as itself because of the supervision. And so we don't put that entity many times. We don't replicate or put many boxes into the ER diagram. We just put one box and make the connections through the relationships, which are going to be the diamonds here. Now, if we wanted, and we want to make this ER diagram even more complete, then we would add the little bubbles that would be the attributes. So the project ID, for example, the project name. Okay. Depending on how the ER diagram is represented, we might have those attributes also there as kind of like bubbles. Okay. In some cases, the ER diagram is just represented like this, and there's another diagram or another model that we're going to be seeing further on, which is called a relational model, where we are going to be able to identify the attributes there. If we just represent the diagram like this, then it's still useful to be able to graphically or visually rather identify all the relationships that we have. Okay. As you might imagine, what is going to be the next exercise that you guys are going to do on Thursday? Well, we've got the COVID-19 registration, and we've got the examples that each of you worked on. So you should already have the entities. We already have the entities identified. We already have the relationships, correct? We already have the relationships, Ricardo, and I believe that we'd already identified the cardinality, if I'm not mistaken. And some of you had already started identifying the attributes. Okay, so what are you going to do on Thursday? A heads up. On Thursday, the idea is for you guys to work on defining the attributes, clearly defining the attributes, and doing the ER diagram for each of those for the COVID-19 registration, the problem that was assigned specifically to your houses. Now, something very important for those exercises when we do them next Thursday is that please remember for both the COVID-19 registration and for your exercises that we had reviewed them, and we had established guidelines for the entities. So you should be using the latest version of that, which was the revised version of the entities that we had discussed. Okay, those, and remember that each team we had made observations of which entities we were going to stay with, and in the COVID-19 registration, which is actually in one of the in the Unit 2 PowerPoint, Unit 2 Part 2 PowerPoint, if I'm not mistaken, we had written down the latest version of the COVID-19 registration entity. So those are the ones we're going to be using. Okay. Okay. Questions before we move on?
No.
Okay, we're good.
I'm good.
Okay, good, good. So what are we going to do now? Okay, so if there aren't any questions, we're going to pause here.